Thank you, Tan, and thank you all for coming. It is my pleasure to introduce Christiana Zenner, who is Associate Professor of Theology, Science, and Ethics in the Department of Theology at Fordham University, where she is also affiliated faculty in Environmental Studies and American Studies. Dr. Zenner holds a BA from Stanford University in Human Biology, and she received her Master of Arts in Religion from Yale Divinity School, summa cum laude, and she was also the recipient of the High Scholarship Award. In 2011, she received the PhD in Religious Studies with distinction from Yale University. Her research into emerging and established freshwater ethics intersects with ecological theory, religious ecologies, developments in earth sciences, and the ecological turn in Catholic social teaching. She lectures nationally and internationally on these topics and has provided analysis of contemporary topics in ecological ethics and religion and science venues, such as Public Radio International, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the New Republic, the Washington Post, TED Ed, MSNBC, and others. Professor Zenner is the author of a phenomenal book. You should all go to the library, go to the bookstore, and buy this, Just Water, Theology, Ethics, Global Freshwater Crisis, in its second edition. And she is co-author of 2 volumes on sustainability and bioethics. Her peer-reviewed articles are published in venues such as Wiley Interdisciplinary Reviews, Water, the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences, the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion, the Journal of Catholic Social Thought, the Journal of Moral Theology, CTU's own New Theology Review, and the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics. Dr. Zenner teaches a range of undergraduate and graduate courses, including religion and ecology, human nature after Darwin, ecological ethics, and theology and contemporary science. She's headquartered at Fordham University's Lincoln Center in the heart of New York City. And in recent months, Dr. Zenner has examined Pope Francis' call in Laudato Si for greater attention to indigenous ecological knowledge and cultural traditions as sources of wisdom regarding the environment. This presentation will then examine the implications of such a turn, drawing especially on documents from Pope Francis and the Amazonian Synod, decolonial literature, and case studies of divergent values attributed to fresh water. And now it is my great pleasure to call Dr. Zenner to the podium to address the topic, Fresh Waters and the Implications of Pope Francis's Turn to Indigenous Ecological Knowledge. Chrissy, please come.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nantwir and Dr. Sasson, for inviting me. It's always very humbling to be introduced in such ways by people whom I hold in great esteem. So thank you for that, and thanks to all of you for having me and for coming on this balmy February Monday to hear a talk about water and Pope Francis's turn to indigenous ecological knowledge. This is officially, I must say, the first lecture series to which I've been invited as a speaker that purports to have historical in the title. This is not standardly my purview. For me, history goes back to about 1891 in Catholic social teaching, Rerum Novarum, or maybe to the 16th, 17th century and the invention of the steam engine and that sort of thing. I'm kidding a little bit. But in the sweep of the Catholic moral tradition, the topics that I tend to deal with are of relatively recent purview. Such is the case with the turn to fresh water, as Don noted in my book, and so too with what is a very, very new, to me, new thing in Catholic social teaching, namely the invocation of the value of indigenous cultures on their own by Catholic magisterial authorities, and also the turn to indigenous ecological knowledges as sources of wisdom about the natural world, and perhaps, we might conjecture, fodder for ethical thinking as well. I will say that this is a work in progress, so I am exploring ways of thinking about some of these intersecting themes that are emerging. One, of course, is fresh water. That's not a surprise, given what I tend to be interested in, but this is the first official talk where I've spoken in some detail about what I see as one of the most revolutionary aspects of Pope Francis's encyclical, Laudato Si' 2015, and that is his turn to indigenous cultural value and knowledge. And I think that it's very important, given the timing of this lecture, to note that on Wednesday at noon, Rome time, Pope Francis will be releasing, with the Vatican Press Office, his own document on the Pan-Amazonian Synod. So I will be very interested to hear and see what he has to say about that, and perhaps we can consider this talk the warm-up for what he will be saying. There may be some things that are accurate conjecture, there may be others that are contradicted. That will be a fun thing to figure out as well. What is certain about that document, Querida Amazonia, is that it will be interpreted by the news media and many parts of the Catholic Church with a focus on questions of priestly marriage and women's roles. Surely these are good and important questions, not only for religious affiliation in the Amazon, but also around the world, because all of us know the urgency of the issue of sacerdotal vocations to serve a wide range of communities. The Pan-Amazon Synod last fall, of course, brought those issues to the forefront. I am, however, largely bracketing the questions of gender and priesthood and so forth today, because I think that there are some other really important questions that we can examine. And those are primarily ecological and social. They're deeply imbricated with patterns of power, both historical and contemporary, and they're worth examining in some detail together in the next 45 minutes. Now, Dawn has said more than I thought she was going to say in the introduction, so I'll truncate my remarks on how I came to be giving this talk. But because my first book was titled Just Water, it was originally published in 2014 and then again in 2018 because Pope Francis in the intervening years came out with Laudato Si', which on the one hand was, oh shoot, well I published this book and now there's Pope Francis. That's great. Luckily, I'm happy to say, and my tenure committee agrees, that I was right with a lot of the conjectures of where I thought Catholic social teaching was going on this. So then I ended up publishing a revised edition of Just Water that includes many statements and documents from Pope Francis into the analysis. But there's another element in the title, as I signaled earlier, and that's the turn to indigenous communities' ecological knowledges. And several years ago, in a number of things I was publishing as one of the interpreters of Laudato Si', I indicated that I think of all the things that Pope Francis discusses in his characteristic charismatic mode, his elevation of indigenous cultural knowledges and his exhortation to respect these cultures is among the most radical parts of the encyclical. It is relatively brief, it is not its own section or even subsection, but in 3 or 4 quotations, the impulse is clearly there. And as environmental activist and writer Bill McKibben wrote in August 2015 in the New York Review of Books, this is, in fact, very notable, coming from the head of an institution that, quote, once set out to universalize the world, end quote. So when I was invited to give this lecture, it seemed to me both timely and important to explore those implications. That is, the implications of Pope Francis's turn, slight though it was at the time, to indigenous ecological knowledge through the lens of fresh water. And of course, the Amazon Synod has only given more oomph to that. I also think that the late Gary Chamberlain, who taught at Seattle University for many years, was entirely right when he wrote in his book on fresh water, rarely in analyses and conversations about water are cultural and in particular religious dimensions brought to light. Yet for billions of the globe's peoples, their fundamental conceptions about the natural world and water are influenced to some degree by religious considerations, whether those are feelings of disdain, indifference, respect, or even love. And that's from his wonderful 2008 book, Troubled Waters. So this lecture today is structured in 3 main parts after this introduction. First, what is the turn to Indigenous ecological knowledge, especially within the church? And I'll say a few situating remarks about the turn to Indigenous ecological knowledge beyond the church. We can discuss that more as that has occurred in other disciplines such as conservation biology and environmental philosophy. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. Then next, what are some examples in the realm of fresh water, and why are these issues not only of governance or politics, but also, in my view, of theological ethics? And then finally, what I'm calling the decolonial imperative, and noting challenges to this in the context of the Catholic Church. So first, what is the turn to Indigenous ecological knowledge within and beyond the church? Well, in good professor style, I'm not going to answer that question right away. To understand the turn to Indigenous ecological knowledge, we must first understand the church's turn to ecology, and I surmise that many of us in this audience are quite familiar, so bear with me. In the 1980s and 90s, Columban missionary Sean McDonough was among the first to point out, at least in the English-speaking world, that for all of the church's forward-thinking social teaching on matters of integral development, politics, economics, and so on, too often missing was the status of the environment and how that was intersecting with social realities. Also during this period, Leonardo Boff was writing Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, the title of which is quoted, though not attributed, in both Laudato Si and the final Pan-Amazon Synod document. And so too at this time were various bishops' conferences in the Philippines and elsewhere, raising the issue of ecological degradation in pastoral letters, such as What is Happening to Our Beautiful Land. In 1990, Pope John Paul II spoke of the ecological crisis as a moral issue, and, skipping here some of the documentary history, Pope Benedict in his 2007 encyclical Caritas in Veritate dedicates a chapter to rights and duties that pertain to the environment. Both Pope John Paul II and Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI were deeply concerned with the relationship between what they called natural ecology, or the degradation of ecosystems and environments, and human ecology, or the caliber of proper forms of human relationships. So when Pope Francis was elected, it was perhaps not entirely surprising that he chose the name of a beloved saint who was well known both for his poverty and his environmental sensitivity, talking to wolves, frolicking with birds, and so forth. And as he remarked in his first papal address, we do not have a very good relationship with creation these days, do we? Now, as Cardinal Peter Turkson tells the tale, Pope Francis very early on said that he wanted to do an encyclical on human ecology. Fast forward several years to 2015, when Laudato Si was promulgated, and it was the first encyclical to centralize ecology as a theological and moral issue in a papal document of this stature. To be clear, it was not the first to raise environmental and social degradations as interwoven, but it was the first to centralize them. Ecology, of course, is a term that signifies different things in different contexts. In environmental studies and conservation biology, for example, ecology signals the study of biotic and abiotic entities and their interactions over time in a given context. In Laudato Si, though, ecology is primarily a relational and even moral category, referring to the caliber of interactions between humans and one another, humans and God, and humans and the earth that sustains. In particular, the notion of integral ecology is one that we might choose to discuss more in the Q&A period, as that is an important, in-process, and yet interestingly vague notion that has strong associations with other parts of environmental philosophy. So when Pope Francis is talking about environmental degradations in terms of environmental science or climate science or whatnot, he usually uses the term environmental ecology. That's what he means when he's talking about ecology as ecologists say it. Ecology for Pope Francis is a bigger, more capacious and relational reality that has a very strong moral component. Every ecological approach, writes Francis, needs to incorporate a social perspective, which takes into account the fundamental rights of the poor and underprivileged. While this includes notions like the common destination of goods of creation, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis also takes this into what one theorist calls an onto-epistemological direction. That is, a direction pertaining to how we talk about being and how we know what we know about such entities. And this happens, I think, in a special way when he speaks of indigenous communities. So Francis speaks of indigenous cultures, and again, this is in Laudato Si, as those for which, quote, land is not a commodity, but rather a gift from God and from their ancestors, a sacred space with which they need to interact if they are to maintain their identity and values. That's paragraph 146. He notes that such cultures, quote, instill a greater sense of responsibility, a strong sense of community, a readiness to protect others, a spirit of creativity, and a deep love for the land, end quote, paragraph 179. And he asserts that, quote, the disappearance of a culture can be just as serious or even more serious than the disappearance of a species of plant or animal. The imposition of a dominant lifestyle can be just as harmful as the altering of ecosystems. Paragraph 145. And finally, quote, it is essential to show special care for indigenous peoples and their cultural traditions. They are not merely one minority among others, but should be the principal dialogue partners, especially when large projects affecting their land are proposed. End quote, paragraph 146. Now, Catholic social teaching, in various ways, has expressed concern about the decline of cultural patrimony and some concern about problems of colonialism. But the practical implications have been somewhat anemic, given the insistence on the primacy of Christian metaphysical truths and the historical complicity of the Catholic Church in colonialism and civilizing missions around the world historically. Presumptively normative, often Western, European, and white Catholic forms of truth have been prioritized, sometimes violently, over other forms of religious or indigenous cultural knowledge. And while this has looked different in many parts of the world, and while there are movements towards more sensitive modes of enculturation, the legacies of colonialism and cultural genocide of ideas and practices is real. The Catholic Church is not the only entity so to be complicit, but it is one. We have only to look, for example, at the throwing of statues in the Tiber River by vandals during the Pan-Amazon Synod to see the enduring legacy of such superiority complexes. Yet more than any other previous pope, Francis seems to be encouraging Catholic social thought to value indigenous cultures while also apologizing for the Church's role in colonialism. Speaking to the World Gathering of Popular Movements during a 2015 trip to Bolivia, Pope Francis remarked, quote, many grave sins were committed against the peoples of America in the name of God, and he's speaking here of South America in particular. I humbly ask forgiveness, he continues, not only for the Church herself, but also for crimes committed against the native peoples during the so-called conquest of America, end quote. Into the present day, he added, forms of colonialism old and new, especially economic, structural forms of domination, deny countries and peoples the right to an integral development and should be resisted. He used the metaphor of a polyhedron. To bring peoples and cultures together, he said, in a form of coexistence which I, Pope Francis, would call polyhedric, where each group preserves its own identity by building together a plurality which does not threaten, but rather reinforces unity. A plurality which does not threaten, but rather reinforces unity. One of the questions we can explore together is who determines what that unity looks like. And I wonder if perhaps the Pan-Amazon Synod is the most recent large-scale visible place where this kind of exchange has occurred. So in the Pan-Amazonian Synod documents, I want to lift up 3 or 4 quotes that I will not do much interpretation of, but I will simply let them rest here. The first one, the pattern of thinking of indigenous peoples offers an integrated version of reality, capable of understanding the multiple connections existing throughout creation. This contrasts with the dominant current of Western thought, that tends to fragment reality in order to understand it, but then fails to articulate the relationships between the various fields of knowledge. Again, this is from the Amazon sit-in final document. That document also states that the defense of the Amazon and its people's life requires a profound personal, social, and structural conversion. The church is included in this call to unlearn, to learn and relearn, in order to overcome any tendency towards colonizing models that have caused harm in the past. In this vein, it is important for us to be aware of the power of neocolonialism, which is present in our daily decisions and the predominant model of development. And the final quote that I'll lift up, the ancestral wisdom of the Aboriginal peoples affirms that Mother Earth has a feminine face. Now, I think that the language of conversion, the naming of colonialism old and new, the invocation of ancestral wisdom, and the imaging of Mother Earth as integrated reality is really important. We'll come back to some of these synod documents, even though there's not time in this lecture today to do so in exhaustive detail. Perhaps a follow-up after Wednesday's announcement from Pope Francis would be in order. So let's take this from a level of abstraction about Indigenous values to a level of specificity through the hermeneutic of fresh water. Fresh waters are supple and absorbent substances, materially shape-shifting and ubiquitous solvents that swiftly absorb chemicals, attributed meanings, and prescribed courses of distribution. Such features make freshwaters very slippery to theorize and almost impossible to contain exhaustively, even as different frames of analysis usefully describe freshwaters for a variety of ends. So we can think of how the natural sciences generate important data about influences on and conditions of the world's freshwater supplies, including imaging of groundwater supply that has helped us understand how much groundwater has fueled development in the 20th and now 21st century. But freshwaters are not merely volumetric, they're not merely subject to the paradigms of the natural sciences, they are not only hydrological. They are, as I like to say, drawing on contemporary geographers, they are also hydrosocial. That is, human patterns of meaning and decisions about distribution, political and economic arrangements, all play a substantial role in how freshwaters are corralled, siphoned, experienced, distributed, and understood, and what justice then means in a variety of contexts. So water, I like to say, is not merely single, nor only hydrological. Freshwaters are plural, and they are hydrosocial. And various kinds of social agreements or moral traditions, ranging from customary hospitality practices in certain countries, giving a glass of water to the thirsty traveler, for example, to governance paradigms and whether fresh water is viewed as a human right or an economic commodity, for example. All of these things dictate who gets water in what ways for what reasons. So what we are going to do now is explore 3 case studies, relatively succinct, in which different, I simply call them cultural religious multiplicities, because why not try to be an anthropologist and a theologian at once? Different cultural religious multiplicities assign different kinds of meaning and value to fresh waters. And in a longer article that I published about a year ago, I parse out, it's called Valuing Fresh Waters, and I parse out how these different epistemologies and understandings of how fresh water functions symbolically and ethically manifest differently in a culture that is increasingly dictated by economic forms of valuation. All right, so case 1, the Catholic Church, magisterial statements on water. Before I launch into this, I will say that for the purposes of this talk, and substantial parts of my book, the focus is on what the magisterium has been saying in formal official documents about fresh water. But I think it's imperative to note that many communities of Catholics on the ground, and especially communities of women religious, have been really far ahead of the curve in advocating for socially just policies pertaining to fresh water, in resisting the privatization of fresh water supplies, and in skepticism about various kinds of extractive industry that would potentially imperil freshwater supplies. Again, so much to discuss when it comes to water. But the reason that I focus on the magisterium now is that it's simply the most visible and most debated form of developing Catholic social thought that is legible to a lot of Catholics and non-Catholics alike. So case one, the Catholic Church, magisterial statements on water. Now, in Western political economic paradigms, freshwater can be viewed as a natural resource, as an economic commodity, and sometimes as a human right. And as I describe in Just Water, the book, much of the activism surrounding freshwater in the 90s and early 2000s surrounded this question of whether freshwater was best understood as an economic commodity or as a fundamental human right. Into that debate, the Catholic Church endorsed the view that freshwater is a fundamental human right, in fact, that it is essential for the fulfillment of all other rights, and was a substantial part of advocacy for the affirmation of that right by the United Nations in 2010. So it's not surprising that Laudato Si raises the topic of fresh water as a concern in the very first chapter. And for those of you not super familiar with Laudato Si, chapter 1 basically says, hey, everyone who lives on planet Earth. Now, I'm not just talking to Christians of goodwill, I'm talking to all of us. We've got an issue with environmental degradation. Here are 5 or 6 ways that we can see it. Freshwater is number 2. Pope Francis says a major problem is the consumption and pollution of fresh water, especially drinking water, where environmental and social patterns interconnection is revealed pretty acutely. He writes, a particularly serious problem is the quality of water available to the poor. And in keeping with previous social teaching, Laudato Si expresses concern about the privatization of fresh water, hence the bottles, because access, this is a quote, access to safe drinkable water is a basic and universal human right, essential for human survival and as such, a condition for the exercise of other human rights, end quote, that's paragraph 30. At a 2017 summit at the Vatican, a couple of years later, Pope Francis stated, quote, it is essential that each state act as a guarantor of universal access to safe and clean water. With the little we have, we will be helping to make our common home a more livable and fraternal place, better cared for, where none are rejected or excluded, but all enjoy the goods needed to live and grow in dignity. Now, before I critique this, let me say that human rights language is great, and it's very valuable as it strives to make moral ideas universally accessible and governments accountable within a framework of international communication and action. But critics also note, and rightly, that oftentimes human rights frameworks are almost always based in Western philosophical and political economic assumptions, and therefore tend to be highly individualistic and anthropocentric, while omitting more than human entitlements. Might water itself, however we understand that, have a right to exist in an uninterrupted, unpolluted, undredged state? In other words, what about the rights of water, not just human rights to water? Such notions may sound far-fetched to those of us trained in post-Enlightenment Western philosophical and theological traditions, but the idea that water or other environmental entities might be entitled to rights or that the earth has a right to clean water itself is not so far afield. Consider, for example, the 2010 Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, a really interesting document that resulted from the massive World People's Conference on Climate Change in Bolivia. The Declaration identifies certain entitlements that are due to the earth, notably imaged here as mother, quote, without distinction of any kind, such as may be made between organic and inorganic beings, species, origin, use to human beings, or any other status, end quote. And the document further holds that, quote, Mother Earth has a right to regenerate its biocapacity and continue its vital cycles and processes free from human disruptions, which predominantly includes the right to water as a source of life, end quote. Now, the second case that I want to mention briefly is Standing Rock in the Dakotas. Many of us in this room, I surmise, will be very familiar with Standing Rock. In brief, as background, the Standing Rock protests began and generated more and more energy over time in resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline, running over a part of tribal lands, possibly imperiling a lake called Lake Oahe that was itself the result of a building project in the 50s by the Army Corps of Engineers that had displaced the native populations the first time in order to build it. But the concern was that parts of the Missouri River would be negatively impacted by potential pipelines, especially were they to rupture. And so the protests over the pipeline that ensued were based in a number of claims. Claims about tribal sovereignty over land and waters that pass through territories. Claims about histories of colonialism and forced relocation of the tribes. And claims about the values of water as a life-sustaining entity, as well as claims about humans' obligations to water. So again, not just what humans deserve in terms of water in a rights framework, but what responsibilities humans owe as protectors of the water. There are some really good documentaries out on Standing Rock now, and an excellent book by Nick Estes, E-S-T-E-S, who is a journalist and scholar of American studies in New Mexico, who himself is of Lakota descent. And much of how he situates the Standing Rock actions, I don't always want to call them protests because they weren't necessarily always understood as protests, but much of how he writes about and understands Standing Rock is situated within the histories of US settler colonialism. It's a really great text for reading and thinking with. And the symbolism of some of the moments in the conflicts are very acute. This is a moment in November 2016 when peaceful protesters who, nonviolence was very, very important on the Indigenous side of the actions, were sprayed by water cannons by the troops, private militia, for lack of a better word, assembled there. And so spraying freezing water as a weapon into the bodies and faces of nonviolent protesters has a symbolism that can't but help recall some of the civil rights protests with the water cannons, and also the ways in which water itself can be weaponized. I think it's also noteworthy that it wasn't just Indigenous peoples, and specifically Lakota, Dakota Sioux, who were serving as water protectors and going to this site, but Standing Rock became a very, very active site of convergence and advocacy for a number of populations who wanted to support the water protection efforts there. A good number of veterans, a good number of people from a range of other religious communities and activist communities went also to offer support. So while tribal sovereignty was the basis of legal challenges to the Dakota Access Pipeline, it's ideas of the sacred that permeate the water protectors' actions. Prominent slogans included "We are water," "Water is sacred," and "Mini-Wishoni," which translates to "water is life." All of these phrases and their philosophical or cosmological underpinnings, I think, are potent portals to 21st century appeals to justice and to Indigenous values in the face of historic and ongoing territorial and cultural disenfranchisement. To me, Mini-Wishoni summons the idea that the sacredness of waters that sustain human beings, communities, and more than human ecosystems moves well beyond the language of human rights. As the Standing Rock Sioux phrased it, "In honor of future generations, we fight this pipeline to protect our water, our sacred spaces, and all living beings." In that, I cannot help but hear the kind of integrated cosmological vision that some of the Pan-Amazonian documents and Pope Francis's turn to Indigenous ecological knowledge in Laudato Si seem to be referencing. And then case 3, fairly recent, which came out this past fall and winter, the Pan-Amazon Synod documents. Apropos of the timing of this lecture and the imminent anticipated document from Pope Francis, I want to say a few words about the Amazon Synod and its invocation on Indigenous ecological knowledge as well as fresh water. Let me say that I don't have an embargoed copy of Pope Francis's document, though I obviously wish I did. But I have heard from a couple of people that it's, quote, relatively short, unquote, 40 pages, which is kind of hilarious because the entire Amazon Synod final document is 45. So there you go, a 40-page commentary on a 45-page document. Okay. I think that the appeals to Indigenous ecological knowledge as we see it emerging in the Catholic Church since 2015, and specifically through the lens of fresh water, seem to be interwoven in three ways. One, the exhortation to respect for cosmovisions and worldviews. These are particular phrases that the documents seem to use. Two, the desire to integrate Indigenous ecological knowledges under the rubric of integral ecology. This is one area that I think is very much in motion, as I mentioned earlier. What does integral ecology mean? How do Indigenous ecological knowledges fit with or challenge that? There seems to be a lot of confidence in the Catholic magisterium that all of these things are unifiable. I'm not so sure that such is always the case. Sometimes good values do conflict. And Dan Horan, I think you have a lot to say about integral ecology, so I expect you to speak up later. And then third, recognition of the pluralities of meanings of fresh waters. Given my own epistemic conceits of insisting that fresh waters are plural and not singular, I think this is very healthy. So some more quotes, and this I am just going to read you a bunch of them. First, this is section 44. The pattern of thinking of Indigenous peoples offers an integrated vision of reality, capable of understanding the multiple connections existing throughout creation. This contrasts with the dominant current of Western thought that tends to fragment reality in order to understand it, but then fails to articulate the relationships between various fields of knowledge. If that sounds familiar, it's because you heard it before. Speaking especially of pre-contact populations, the Synod document also says, let us recognize that they have taken care of their land, their waters, and their forests for thousands of years, and have managed to preserve them until today, so that humanity might enjoy and benefit from the free gifts of God's creation. That's in paragraph 14. Speaking of the Amazon and its biodiverse richness, the Synod document says, the water and land of this region nourish and sustain the natural world, the life and cultures of hundreds of communities, Indigenous, peasant, Afro-descendant, mestizo settlers, river dwellers, and urban dwellers. Water, the source of life, has a rich symbolic meaning. In the Amazon region, the water cycle is the great connector. It connects ecosystems, cultures, and the development of the territory. That's paragraph 7. There is a long paragraph in paragraph 9 that's worth looking at that talks about Amazonian indigenous philosophies of good living, or buen vivir, which the Synod document says is fully realized in the Beatitudes. Interesting, curious, not sure. The document goes on to say, such an understanding of life is characterized by the interconnection and harmony of relationships between water, territory and nature, community life and culture, God, and various spiritual forces. Good living means understanding the centrality of the transcendent relational character of human beings and of creation, and implies good acting. That's paragraph 9. In a brief analysis of this, I would say that there seems to be a great deal of confidence in this document that Indigenous values and ecological knowledges can be dialogically integrated with Catholic pastoral and ethical commitments. I think that is optimistic and likely often true, but not always. I think that particularly, we can talk about this in more detail, but I think that one of the dangers of such a blithe optimism is not seeing where values for water or the kinds of relational obligations that flow from them might conflict with paradigms to which the church is committed, say the human right to water. And I think it's often in those moments of potential conflict that much is illuminated. So I think it will be very, very important to see not only how Pope Francis approaches the issue on Wednesday, but also to ask, what is required of us, those of us who theorize and want to stand with the peoples, not just of the Amazon, but also of the world, when we listen to and invoke indigenous ecological knowledge? I think the challenge is especially important to mark when asked by someone such as myself, obviously a white woman whose life has been made possible by settler colonialism in this nation, and of a church that has, well, a rather dismal track record on colonialism, complicity in cultural eradication, and confidence about its own universal truths over and against other cultures. Now again, progress has been made in these areas, but the work is ongoing. It's not to say that the turn to indigenous ecological knowledge is unwarranted. It's important, but it is to say that this must be done really, really carefully. So that leads us to concluding remarks, what I'm calling decolonial imperatives. Colonialism is tricky. As the decolonial theorist Walter Mignolo has written, coloniality is a condition of modernity as we know it today. It is the predicate of Western so-called rationality and all that has issued forth religiously, politically, economically, and environmentally from those frames. The challenge then, here for this talk, is to honor indigenous values on their own terms so far as possible, without replicating epistemic and embodied violences of colonialism, not only in terms of territorial seizure or the marketization of certain natural resources, what Pope Francis refers to as neocolonialism, but also in terms of expropriating knowledge and values. Like lands and ceremonies, indigenous values, this is a quote, have been misappropriated, misrepresented, and exploited as a common practice of colonialism, end quote. So how can this turn to indigeneity proceed in a way that includes a lot of epistemic humility? At least as it pertains to water, folks who work on this in the water world say that scholars and practitioners must be cautious to avoid reproducing colonial hydrological ways of knowing and being. And also, indigenous is hardly a uniform category. So when we talk about the turn to indigenous ecological knowledge, or use the definite article the to refer to the indigenous worldview, we need to be really, really careful, because indigeneity is plural and there is no such one thing as the indigenous cosmovision, even if there may be points of connection and consistency. At worst, sorry to say, some of the Synod documents and quotes I read appear to gloss over that plurality. So I think it's important, as one moment of corrective, one important first step, is to attend to plurality within indigeneity as a way to avoid reinscribing forms of colonial domination on human and other bodies of water. And second, that the expansion of values discourse for fresh waters has to occur with accountability to communities' own practices, articulations, and verifications. And I think much of what happened in the Amazon Synod did seem to do that in a really beautiful and meaningful way. But it can't merely be metaphoric or performative or, again, knowledge usurping. One quote that I love from authors Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang is that indigenous values cannot be grafted onto pre-existing frameworks. They cannot be grafted onto pre-existing discourses / frameworks, even if they are critical, even if they are anti-racist, even if they are justice frameworks. That's from a great article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. So what Pope Francis calls a polyhedric approach may need to branch into something a little different or differently dimensional. One notion I like from decolonial studies is the idea of, this is a mouthful, pluriversal and interversal decoloniality. Try saying that 7 times fast. Proposed by decolonial scholars Catherine Walsh and Walter Mignolo. They write, quote, "Such perspective does not mean a rejection or negation of Western thought. In fact, Western thought is part of the pluriversal. Western thought and Western civilization are in most, if not all of us. But this doesn't mean a blind acceptance, nor does it mean surrendering to North Atlantic fictions. Our interest and proposition here are, more crucially, with re-existence, understood as the redefining and re-signifying of life in conditions of dignity. End quote. They're not Catholic, they're not theologians, they're decolonial social theorists who work in a range of contexts around the world. But I'm struck by the ways in which that could be compatible with a Catholic theological ethics of a turn to Indigenous ecological knowledges. To conclude, when Indigenous values matter to water discourses, or to Catholic formulations of integral ecology, freshwaters become plural, such that these accounts of what water is, how it functions, and how we know, can challenge, enrich, and even overturn what is standardly assumed to be hydrologically obvious. So there's much more to be said about the turn to Indigenous cultures and values, and I look forward to those conversations. Thank you.